From where we last left off, the RMS Lusitania set sail for the first time in 1907, and for 7 years the public sailed on her and even marveled and fell in love with the ship as well. However, in 1910, fate would deal her a bad hand. She survived a rogue wave in 1910, thus busting out windows that left a permanent deck depression, and she underwent the changes, such as her propellers being swapped out and additional lifeboats, after the sinking of the RMS Titanic. 2 years after the sinking of the RMS Titanic, a cataclysmic event is about to take place as European nations started firing shots at each other, causing a war like no other. On July 28th of 1914, World War I erupted across the continent of Europe after political tensions from Austria-Hungary to Serbians. A month prior to the war, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb, causing a domino effect of nationalism, militarism, imperialism, and alliances. It was at this moment that the world back then changed forever. Both ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, will be called up to be armed merchant cruisers by the British Admiralty, but the biggest problem for both of these ships is that their engines were actually not suitable to be used for armed merchant cruisers. Simply what Cunard did, they did some tests, conducted some research for their engines, and it turns out that for both of their engines, they would chew up a lot of coal. Now, the engines are actually pretty efficient for their coal usage if they were doing what they were doing, which is basically crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Now, for being an armed merchant cruiser, which basically means patrolling around the Atlantic Ocean, used to protect a convoy, and so on and so forth. So, due to the slow speed, the engines use too much coal and is actually not practical. So the Mauretania would actually be put into storage, and the Lusitania would continue her transatlantic crossings. Many of the large liners laid up in 1914 to 1915 due to the fall in demand of passenger travel across the Atlantic Ocean. Basically, passengers trying to get out of Europe, trying to get out of the war area, because they don't want to be a part of it, they don't want to be affected by it. So the Lusitania was actually requisitioned by the British Admiralty, but to be used as an armed merchant cruiser, and she was actually put on the list of the official AMCs. Now, although she was not armed in her career or requisitioned fully, and still being used for transatlantic crossings. Now, Lusitania would still remain on the list as an auxiliary cruiser in the 1914 edition of Jane's All the World's Fighting Ships, and even the Mauretania would be on this list as well. The first month of the war, and on our first voyage after war was declared in Europe, while leaving New York Harbor, one of Lusitania's 4 turbine engines broke down. With only 3 operating, this would greatly reduce her speed. Speculation would rise saying that the machinery was sabotaged by Germany, and there were even rumors of a plot of blowing up a German liner in retaliation, to which is the SS Vaterland, which was detained by the United States at the time war broke out. Local law enforcement responded quickly to protect the liner from any future sabotage. There was speculation from Herbert Corey, who was a war correspondent, gave his account saying there was no doubt that the ship was tampered while the ship lay at the pier. A screw the size of a 5-cent piece, before played hob with a delicate engine, had even said that the evident plan was not to prevent the Lusitania from sailing, but to cripple her and make her an easy target for a faster vessel that may be in her wake. For those that never knew this fact, the Lusitania at this time frame was painted a drab gray scheme, and this was to make her less visible and difficult to detect. It didn't take long for Germany to unleash a deadly new weapon to the seas, the U-boat. For those that don't know, a U-boat is a German submarine that is designed to hunt down and torpedo ships and sink them. At first, the British Admiralty didn't take the threats of U-boats seriously, as they didn't think that Germany was too serious about the U-boats. As the months go by and the ships being lost, they realize that the U-boat threat is real and are a force to be reckoned with. Now, before we get further into the story of the Lusitania, there's actually one specific treaty that was signed in the 1850s called the Treaty of Paris. Or the longer name for this is the Paris Declaration Respecting Maritime Law. And this was a treaty that was signed by all 55 maritime nations except for the United States and Spain. And this is ironic since Germany also signed on this as well. That a newer international agreement called the London Declaration concerning the laws of naval warfare. But there's actually one part of that treaty that you need to understand regarding into the naval warfare, and this is why this is so important to the Lusitania story. The one section is actually regarding to the story of the Lusitania is cruiser rules. And the whole point of this is to safeguard civilian vessels and safeguard civilian lives with minimum casualties as possible. So, the way it goes like this, you have a battleship or a warship that spots a unarmed enemy vessel. The armed ship actually has two options to safeguard the vessel and to safeguard the civilian lives. They can either leave the vessel alone or search the vessel for contraband. Now, if the armed vessel does leave the unarmed ship alone, they just let them go on about their day and not worry. But in case if they want to inspect the ship, they can let them know, hey, we're going to board your ship just to make sure you're not carrying anything that you are not carrying. But if they do find anything, such as weapons or munitions or just about anything used for war, then the ship is going to be declared as a use for military purposes and be classified as a ship for use for the military. Then the armed vessel crew has one or two options. One, they can either capture the ship as a prize war, or number two, they can just simply sink the ship by sinking it. If option number two is made, the crew must make sure all civilians are evacuated off the ship and less casualties would be involved. While on paper the cruiser rules make sense and is easy to enforce, especially in wars before the First World War. During World War I, as technology evolves rapidly, there are new machines that are implemented, such as submarines and airplanes, and it's hard to safeguard civilian lives during this time frame. While both subs and airplanes are good tools to use during war, the hardest part is to fine-tune the target to make sure you're taking out a military ship or a military installation. Due to this, it is inevitable that there will be civilian casualties. During this time frame, there are also neutral countries, and neutral countries that are not involved with the First World War. Thus, in rules of warfare, these countries should not be fired upon. A perfect example of one of these nations that was neutral was the United States of America, as they would remain neutral up until the last remaining years of the First World War. So, a clause in the Declaration of Paris that also protects these neutral countries, and according to cruiser rules, all vessels should have a flag hoisted on their masts to let other ships or U-boats know what nationality the ship belongs to. So, if you have a British ship, it basically needs to fly the British flag, the American ship, American flag, German ship, German flag, so on and so forth. This is to protect the ones that are not involved in the conflict, but however, there's actually a growing issue of false flags being hoisted up as a form of camouflage, and Lusitania is well known for this one. This is why Lusitania has one of the most controversial moments in World War One. And flying a false flag definitely violates cruiser rules, and this is not to be done, and as a result, it would be difficult for both sides to know what's if they are firing on an enemy vessel or not. And there would be instances where British ships will hoist American flags, and this is a massive problem for U-boat captains trying to second guess themselves if the ship is an American vessel or not. So they just basically assume the worst and just torpedo the ship with no regards. And this was basically an ongoing issue, and inevitably, a lot more lives would actually be lost. Now we got those out of the way. In the first 10 months of the war, the Lusitania was successful in staying out of trouble, and at this time, the Lusitania was under the command of Captain Daniel Dow. He would know how to operate the ship safely and efficiently. After World War I broke out, Dow was ordered to sail the Lusitania with no flags hoisted, and this would violate the cruiser rules. Dow would strongly disagree, but he was forced to do it, and did it with no complaints. The Lusitania would arrive in Liverpool flying the neutral U.S. flag, and this would be one of the most controversial moves that the Lusitania would do. On March 16th of 1915, the Lusitania was scheduled to arrive in Liverpool, and the Admiralty gave her instructions on how to avoid submarines and Such advice that was added to earlier advice following the declared war zone by Germany that ships should try to evade submarines or steer towards them to force them to dive. Now, these instructions actually do compromise the ship's safety under cruiser rules. There were two warships, the HMS Lewis and the HMS Lavrock, that were actually ordered to escort the Lusitania and took further precaution of sending the Q ship, the HMS Lions, to patrol Liverpool Bay. The captain of the ship at the time, Captain Daniel Dow, made no contact with the destroyers and actually made it to Liverpool unescorted. Now, this was a very, very dangerous move that Captain Dow did, but the stress of everything that was basically getting to Captain Dow, that he requested shore leave from the Lusitania, and to his surprise, it was accepted. It turns out that Captain Dow nor the rest of the passengers know that the Lusitania had a near encounter with a German U-boat, and this was U-27, under the command of Bernhard Wegener, just waiting for the Lusitania to come by. U-27 was tempted to fire at 5 other ships he saw pass by on the approach to Liverpool, and he didn't fear scaring off the Lusitania, as he believed the Lusitania would arrive at Liverpool and waited until March 5th before calling it quits and returned to base. The escort ships contacted the Lusitania by radio, but didn't have the codes to communicate with the merchant ships. But Captain Dow did not give them their position due to the anxiety of thinking that the warships were enemies but not friendlies. Dow would sail the Lusitania unescorted. Later in life, U-27 would later be in the center of controversy when a ship named the HMS Barrowlong attacked and sank the U-27. A future video will be discussed about this incident later on. And when I said that Captain Turner was going to make a return, I meant it. Throughout April, things went smoothly for the Lusitania, staying out of trouble. During Lusitania's 200th crossing, sometime between April 3rd to April 10th, a young male passenger fell ill on the ship and passed away. He would be buried at sea with Captain Turner and his senior officers attending. Lusitania would not stop to do a burial at sea due to the fear of U-boat attacks. And in mid-April, the Lusitania left for her 201st transatlantic voyage, arriving in New York on April 24th. 2 days before the Lusitania got to New York, the German embassy under Johann Heinrich von Bernstorff submitted a warning about travel to 50 American newspapers. It was warned that any travelers intended to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war included the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. It is now May 1st, 1915, a drizzly, misty Saturday morning. As passengers began to head for the terminal, they even took notice of the warning in the newspapers, and the Lusitania's sailings always generated great interest, but this actually sparked a bona fide press frenzy. Now we went over what cruiser rules are, we can further understand the story of the Lusitania and understand why it's one of the most controversial sinkings in the First World War. Now, the main story of the Lusitania's final voyage started on May 1st of 1915 in New York City Harbor. Now, this ship actually sat idle in late April because of the ongoing tensions that were rising in the United States over its military support of the United Kingdom and France. And German intelligence services is actually aware of the mysterious cargo that is basically being transported onto the ship. Now, this cargo is not to be taken lightly. This was basically kept a secret, and if you actually look it up on the ship's manifest, it would actually be disguised as cheese and unrefrigerated butter. So basically, in code, this would be the secret ammunition that the Lusitania would carry on board inside a secret compartment, just in case if the Lusitania were to be stopped by U-boat crews under cruiser rules. So on the Lusitania's final voyage, her cargo manifest actually consists of war-related supplies, with a total of $735,000 US back in 1915, And if you adjust that for inflation, it's over $23 million in today's money. So these supplies would actually be 260,000 of sheet brass, over 111,000 of copper, 58,465 of copper wire, 10 packages of casings, 1,271 cases of ammunitions, 2 packages of engines and materials, and 4,200 cases of cartridges and ammunitions. So basically, this is basically your small arms, your rifle, munitions, and many more. The warning in the newspaper that was mentioned earlier in this video also turned some heads, while some canceled their bookings to the Lusitania and some even laughed it off, saying there was no way the Germans would be serious about torpedoing a ship. The biggest defense for the Lusitania is her speed. She held the blue ribbon in the past and can quickly outrun a German U-boat. While German U-boats only have a top speed of 17.7 knots, while underwater is 7.6 knots. Captain Turner called the warning, "Why, it's the best joke I have heard in many days. Germany can focus their entire fleet of submarines on our tracks, and we would elude them." As much we hate to say that he is wrong, but he'll be proven wrong, but we're actually getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Passengers started arriving at Pier 54 in taxis or complimentary shuttles as they make their way down to the piers as they will haul their luggage. As the Lusitania attracted the attention of the higher society, their arrivals drew attention from the crowds that gathered along the wharf. Up at the grandstands where the crowds gathered to watch the Lusitania's departure, several German ships were detained at Hoboken from the Hamburg American lines and the Norddeutsch line. As it was time for the Lusitania to leave, family members said goodbye to their friends and family members as they filed back down to the pier, and originally, the Lusitania was supposed to depart at 10 a.m., but it already came and gone. And now the ship is delayed by 2 hours, but why? So there was another ship that was also requisitioned by the British Admiralty as well, and this is the SS Cameronia from the Anchor Line. She was recently requisitioned at the last minute to be a troop transport ship, thus stranding 41 of her passengers at the pier. Now, traveling agents were trying to scramble, basically get their passengers onto their flagship, the Transylvania, which was scheduled to depart on May 7th. Cunard Line, who's actually the parent company to Anchor Line, actually decided to move the passengers from the Cameronia to the Lusitania. Now, if you compare and contrast the reactions from both of the ship's passengers, the Cameronia were actually very thrilled, while in contrast, the Lusitania, the passengers kept waiting. They were actually not thrilled. So Cunard would actually help pay for the taxicabs to transport the Cameronia passengers from their ship to the Lusitania. Then after 11:30 a.m., visiting family members that wanted to board the Lusitania for the very last time to see their family members. And just as you thought, the Lusitania was about to get underway. Well, unfortunately, it got delayed again, but this time, it's from a much higher up individual. You see, Captain Turner's niece, actress Mercedes Desmond, came on board to visit. So the night prior, Captain Turner visited his niece backstage at the New Amsterdam Theater, where she was actually performing The Lie, which is a Henry Arthur Jones play. So on that same day, the Lusitania was about to leave for her 202nd crossing. Desmond actually came to say goodbye to Turner, and dockyard workers removed the gangways. They were unaware that there was actually one more person on board the ship that's not even supposed to be on there. So Captain Turner was so furious that he actually ordered the gangway to be returned so that way his niece can disembark. This would actually delay the departure 20 more minutes, and this was heavily criticized by the passengers on board, and it was actually this move alone and everything else prior before up to this moment actually sealed the Lusitania's fate long before she even left the pier. At 12:10 p.m., the order for Lusitania to depart from Pier 54 from New York was given. The film footage you are seeing is the only known film of the Lusitania being pulled out of the pier and turned to go down the Hudson River. And 2 hours later, the Lusitania left New York, carrying 1,960 people on board, with 693 crew members and 1,264 passengers. Majority are British nationalities, as well as a large number of Canadians, 159 Americans. First class would be booked at half capacity, while second class was overbooked with 601 and third class 370. Tugboats would help pull the Lusitania out of Pier 54, and then her turbine engines turned on and she blasted her whistle that she was leaving. As the ship was reversed, the cameramen that were on the grandstands filmed the Lusitania's departure, with one jokingly said, "We're going to call this picture Lusitania's final voyage." Only if they knew, only 6 days later, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Lusitania backed out fully, and you can see Captain Turner as he is on the starboard side bridge wing before the ship is now out to the Hudson River. And Captain Turner would also keep the speed low as he navigates the ship downriver. As we see here, the Lusitania is being turned so that way that the ship can go downriver and easily go out into the Atlantic Ocean, leaving the American seaboard far behind. Another person I would like to thank for this incredible footage of the Lusitania departing from New York is Russell Off from the Historic Travels Discord server. Thank you very much for giving me the footage, man. Greatly appreciated. So before the ship even left New York fully, as the ship sailed down the Hudson River, there's already an event going on that is actually underway. Stewards who actually go down into the lower decks of the ship just to check for stowaways. And whenever in war, whenever you have a passenger ship going into a war zone, stewards often check the lower areas, the lower cabins, for any stowaways that can possibly cause sabotage to the ship. Now, remember what I said earlier about what happened to one of the turbine engines for the Lusitania 1 month after the war began? Well, they didn't want to take that chance. They did not want to take that risk. The 3 German spies tried to sneak inside the ship with camera equipment. Even though they were successful getting into the ship, they would eventually be caught in the ship's port side pantry and are arrested on board. Detective Inspector William Pierpoint was contacted by Staff Captain James Anderson about the smugglers on board as they were eventually caught. Pierpoint brought on Adolf Peterson, the German interpreter for the Lusitania. The spies refused to answer any questions and were later detained into a third-class cabin that is made into a makeshift brig, and they would face later interrogation when the ship arrived in Liverpool and be handed over to the appropriate British authorities. Their intentions were pretty murky, but speculation was to photograph the munitions that are on board. So it was actually very fortunate that the passengers were not aware of this incident whatsoever. Now, had word got out, passengers would have been very skeptical or very antsy about the whole situation and basically the whole entire crossing as well. So the Lusitania will go up to near full speed once the Lusitania cleared American territory, and passengers would watch as the American coastline actually starts to vanish and fade away into the fog. The Lusitania's first stop before reaching out into the open waters were 3 British ships that were outlined in the fog that were confined within the New York harbor, but only one of them is actually very familiar to Captain William Turner. The HMS Bristol, the RMS Coronia, a Cunarder which is now requisitioned for war services as an merchant cruiser, the HMS Glory, and the HMS Essex were in American waters as their mission was to keep the German liners such as the Vaterland and other German liners confined within New York harbor. Turner would encounter these ships and gave the order to full astern to stop the ship. Small boats would be lowered and rowed towards the Lusitania as the cargo was mail and documents to be transferred to the Lusitania. Afterwards, Captain Turner gave the command all ahead full, and the Lusitania is on her way with propellers churning in the wake. The photograph you see here is the last known photograph of the Lusitania that was taken on board the British cruiser, the HMS Glory. You may notice that 3 of her 4 funnels is billowing out smoke. But why is that? Just as we see in the photograph, the Lusitania was operating with only 3 of her 4 boiler rooms lit. Her 4th one, which is right back here where the 4th funnel is, was actually shut down just to save fuel and manpower. But unfortunately, this came at a pretty good hefty cost though. You see, With this fourth boiler room shut down, it also slowed down the Lusitania's speed from her top speed of 25 knots to 21 knots. And this actually also has an effect on rationing as well. And don't get me wrong, Lusitania's best defense is her speed. That's why she even won the Blue Ribbon multiple times, going up and down the eastern seaboard and also back to the United Kingdom and vice versa. You see, the speed for the Lusitania is her best defense against U-boats because U-boats don't go to their top speed up on the surface, and they even get worse speed when they dive underwater. Now, with the pre-events already out of the way, we're actually going to go over some of the most notable faces that would board the Lusitania for her 202nd crossing. The first one is American theater manager Charles Frohman, who was starting his annual trip to Europe to oversee his London and Paris play market, as he intended to travel earlier but delayed his departure due to ill health. Frohman was warned against it due to a notice from the German embassy that appeared in the American newspapers. He sent a telegram stating, "If you want to write for me, just address the letter, care of the German submarine U-4. And traveling with Frohman is actress Rita Jolivet, a British actress in theater and silent films. Alfred Vanderbilt is also another famous name that boarded the ship, as he is bound for Great Britain for business along with his valet. Vanderbilt family established a railroad empire, and Alfred, even though by the age of 37, proved an adept businessman and real estate tycoons. Angela Papadopoulos and her husband Michael were returning home from Greece after traveling from Philadelphia for business purposes. They crossed the Lusitania in the past before and are now returning for the eastbound journey to Liverpool. Third-class passenger Frederick R. Bailey boarded the Lusitania to visit her father, accompanied by his sister and brother-in-law, Agnes and Albert Veals. Queen Benjamin was returning home to Nottinghamshire, although it is unclear where she had traveled from. She may have come from either Roland, Oklahoma, or Roland Park, Maryland, before arriving in New York City to board the Lusitania. Second-class passenger Margaret Galligan and her aunt Bridget Lee had initially planned to travel to Ireland on board another ship, which is the SS Cameronia. However, as we all learn, the British Admiralty withdrew the Cameronia from transatlantic services as they were forced to reschedule and book tickets for the Lusitania instead. 17-year-old Thomas Peacock Jr. was traveling with his mother, Elizabeth. However, it is unclear where they were coming from or where they headed to. 2-year-old Robert Logan, a third-class passenger, was traveling with his mother, Ruth Logan, to Scotland, where they were set to meet his father, James, who is currently serving in the British Army. Another second-class passenger, a 12-year-old by the name of Avis Dolphin, was traveling to England from Canada. Having originally immigrated in 1907, her widowed mother was helping her receive an English education. Avis was heading to study at Wellington School, either in Somerset or Temperley, as she traveled with her mother's nurses accompanying her. Along the way, she met a professor by the name of Ian Holborn, who is traveling back home, as he is a professor and lecturer for the University of Oxford and a writer. Ironically, before sailing, he dreamed 3 times that the Lusitania would be torpedoed. Another saloon passenger came aboard. Now, despite being an experienced traveler, this passenger never boarded a ship before. His name was Charles Emilius Laureat Jr., a bookseller for the Charles E. Laureat Company. Laureat came aboard with his neighbor and friend Lothrop Withington. When he boarded the Lusitania, he knew that 6 of the ship's boilers were shut down. However, he was assured that the ship would be escorted safely through the war zone. He didn't believe that for the fact that he knew as a belligerent ship, Lusitania was likely to be attacked. Additionally, there were 693 crew members already on board. This includes Captain William Turner, boatswain's boy Thomas Quinn Jr., and lookout Leslie Morton. Now, this one doesn't have a photo, but I just want to mention him right here. Thomas Quinn Jr. is the youngest crew member on board the RMS Lusitania, and he had ran away from home in Liverpool to join the Lusitania, and his father also worked on board this ship as well. but instead of sending him back home, he allowed Thomas Jr. to sign on as a boatswain's boy in the deck department on April 12th of 1915, and they left the ship together on the 17th and made the eastbound crossing a few weeks later. Captain William Turner's command resume is impeccable. He joined Cunard in 1878 as a fourth officer, hoping to follow in his father's footsteps. Then in 1903, Turner would command his first ship, the Aleppo. He would also command the Carpathia, Ivernia, the Caronia, Mauritania, Transylvania, Ultonia, and the new RMS Aquitania. Whenever Captain Turner is in command of a new ship, he would often wear a bowler hat for every ship he commanded, thus giving him the nickname of Bowler Bill. Serving alongside Captain Turner is Staff Captain James Anderson, the second in command of the Lusitania. A basic too-long didn't read version of a staff captain is after the loss of the Titanic in 1912, the staff captain was added on by Alfred A. Booth, which results in responsibilities of cargo stowage, discipline of the crew, and even socializing with the passengers, which leaves Captain free to concentrate on navigating the ship. Turner did not like socializing with the passengers, to which he calls them a load of bloody monkeys who are constantly chattering, to which he leaves the responsibility of socializing to Staff Captain James Anderson. Leslie Martin transferred to the Lusitania from his previous ship, the Naiad, along with his brother Cliff Martin. The brothers had arrived in New York after a disastrous last voyage and had no money to travel home. Their father sent the brothers a total of 75 British sterling pounds to purchase a second-class cabin ticket. However, an unnamed officer stopped them and said, "Why do you want to come back to the Lusitania and pay your fare? We've had 10 deckhands run away during this trip to New York. We suspect it's a threat of conscription at home that's causing the issue. I could use 2 boys like you." Now, with that, the Morton brothers signed on as able seamen. Unfortunately, the money that their father sent them was actually used to buy alcohol, and the night before they actually joined the Lusitania, Morton got so drunk after having too many Manhattan cocktails and actually ended up passing out on Broadway. But despite from getting a nasty hangover, he and his brother managed to report for duty on the morning of April 30th. From May 2nd to the early evening hours of May 6th, life on board the Lusitania was actually normal as expected. Passengers would engage in various activities such as concerts, socializing, and enjoying the ship's amenities such as the libraries, the dining rooms, and many more public spaces that are available on board. As passengers were actually enjoying this, the increased anxiety is actually still in the air. It still hangs over them, which is basically the fear of war hitting them. Charles Lariat Jr. actually is one of those with that anxiety. And on the first day of the ship's voyage, he actually noticed that the Lusitania was actually traveling at a very much of a slow speed, which is basically she already logged over 501 miles. At day 2, he thought the ship was getting much slower and slower. Now, we really don't have a chart or basically any way of knowing Lusitania's crossings, but we know that the ship is basically going slower. It would end up taking a week for Lusitania going from New York to Liverpool. So, Lariat Jr. actually stated to his friend, who was actually traveling on board with him, saying, "At this rate, we're not going to make Liverpool on time." On May 5th, the Royal Navy actually sent in an uncoded warning message to all the ships saying submarines active off the south coast of Ireland. Knowing that this ship was actually going into a war zone, some passengers thought it would be very appropriate and important to know proper evacuation procedures up to it, and some of them were actually pretty skeptical, and some were basically asking around the captain, especially one named Ian Holborn, who actually went up to Captain Turner and attempted to persuade him that he should teach the passengers on the importance of lifeboat drills and how to wear life belts, and even to the point of Captain Turner having saloon passenger George Kessler barge into his own cabin, to which he inquired about a ticket listing of the number of a lifeboat in case of the event of an attack. Turner would actually respond to him saying, "I shall speak to the chief officer about it." Did he let him know about it? We don't know for certain. On May 6th, the Lusitania is 75 nautical miles west of the southern coast of Ireland at 5:30 a.m. The lifeboats were prepared and swung out and checked to make sure they were stocked. That afternoon, the Lusitania logged 484 miles, much slower than her usual speeds. Turner would instruct Chief Engineer Bryce to increase the ship's speed to top cruising capacity under the existing steam, volume, and safety conditions. Later, there were two warning messages given to Captain Turner from the British Admiralty. One that was sent at noon, but it wouldn't reach the Lusitania until 8:05 p.m. The instructions from the Admiralty said, avoid headlands, pass harbors at full speed, steer mid-channel course, submarines off Fastnet. That night, a Seamen's Charities Fund concert took place on board in the Saloon Lounge. The concert was held to raise funds for charity, and this consists of a pianist playing Irving Berlin's I Love the Piano, a Scottish comedian tells jokes which fell deaf on Americans' ears, the Welsh choir singing Welsh songs, and a woman singing When I Leave This World Behind. Only two actresses declined to perform, and that were Josephine Brandel and Rita Jolivet. Captain William Turner also attended this event, to which he came up on stage, but not to perform or dance, but to announce that the Lusitania has now finally entered the war zone. He announced that the ship would be in total complete blackout, cover all the skylights to public rooms, and posted double lookouts, close watertight doors, and swing out lifeboats for faster launching. He would also ask men not to light their cigarettes or cigars up on the open decks to avoid detection. Throughout the night, the Lusitania was in a blackout, meaning that all public skylights and portholes were covered and deck lights were extinguished. Everything that the crew is doing to make sure the Lusitania is invisible to the eyes of a periscope in the night. In the next part, we're going to travel back to May 1st, 1915, but this time, we're going to go across the Atlantic Ocean to discuss the Iron Dagger, the Iron Predator in this story, the German submarine U-20, which was commanded by Captain Walther Schweiger.